we're recording. All right. So, opening Premiere, they generally have this sort of start wizard here to prompt you to either open an existing or make a new project. I'm going to make a new project. Pardon me. And I'm going to put it on. And again, whenever you create a new project, they have some settings for you to start this up. Mainly, the most important one is choosing a working folder. Just like in Blender, when you're trying to output files, because you're working in this like lab environment, none of these settings ever like stay updated. The default location to save a project is in this esoteric hidden folder that you don't want to work out of because I don't know where this is. Users ISMD documents Adobe Premiere 12.0. That's not where I want to save my project. I want to save it on my desktop. I'm going to create a new folder and call it midterm. Choose. And I'm going to drag. So I downloaded the audio and frames folders. I'm going to drag them into my midterm folder because always when working, it's good to have a sort of nice sort of organization to your media content. And it makes it easier to back up when all this content is in one folder, and you can take that on your drive, put it like on the cloud, re-download. When you have your Premiere project file in one folder that's always in the same place relative to your media, like frames audio, you're not going to have unlinked media when you open up your like a project file. You know, it's always going to know where to look for your media. So I like to always encourage having like a good folder organization for your projects when you do this. I'm going to leave everything the same, except I'm going to give it a name. We'll just call it midterm. Hit OK. And now we have a midterm Premiere project file in our midterm folder. So first thing I might want to do is import some media. And looking at our window, we have a sort of source and effects window at the top left. We have our program, which is where we view our sequence, our compilation of clips, our sequence of clips. And then we have our timeline, where we organize our clips. And there's these cool prompts on these windows. So import media to start. If you double click in that space, it gives you a prompt. When importing your frames. So again, Blender can, when you're exporting your animations, there is an option to export it as an MP4. But there's a couple reasons why we don't want to do that. One, if Blender crashes at any moment, or maybe you just have to get the hell out of the computer lab, you have to stop your render, like there's no way of recovering a halfway rendered sort of MP4 file. And then you'd have to start over again. With frames, you're just pumping out each frame in the sequence, in the animation. So if you ever need to stop, you just stop and you can start rendering at a different frame next time you start. If it crashes, you can just get to where you were at, start from that point, and continue rendering frames. Same if you need to leave and stop because it can take some time to render. This is how you do it. And another thing about it is that when you render frames, individual frames, and I'm rendering PNG files, which are high quality files, you're working in what we call lossless media. So when you create an MP4 is an encoded media format. So it is the media format of choice for the internet, and that's because it is small, because it is encoded. It's like a zip file for video. They re-encode the data that it takes to display this audio and video for you. It's like an MP3, you know, except for video. And when you encode things, you lose quality. Sometimes there might be some sort of like encoding or digital marks you might see. And when you work with frames like this, you're working with a raw, sort of thinking about like the raw film or something, like the raw photograph of each image in the sequence. And you're not working with compressed video. And again, if you're an animator and like in the future you want to output different versions of like your media, like maybe you want to make an MP4 for the internet, or maybe, hey, you gotta like, you're presenting this at like a screening and you need to give them like a high quality version. You can be rendering from a lossless quality for all these things, so you're not degrading your video quality at any point. So just like in making a GIF, I'm looking at my frames here. I'm going to select the first frame. And then I'm going to go to my options and turn on image sequence. And just like making a GIF in Photoshop, it compiles all these images into a video clip. And we see that clip is 16 seconds long, halfway there. With that media loaded in our project folder, we can kind of scrub through it a little bit. If you hover your mouse over the image, you can sort of go back and forth and scrub through time. And the simplest way to go forward is now we have to, I'm going to save my file, create a sequence. We have media in our folder, and now we have to create a sequence. We have to create the timeline in which this media exists. The best way to do that, it tells you right here, is drop media here to create a sequence. If we do that, now we have a sequence. And we have a sequence file in our project folder. And that is determined, like, so these both look the same. You're like, what is going on? They're identical. The one on the left, the icon on the bottom right, looks like film. That means it is a clip, like a movie clip. The one on the right has what looks like a timeline marker and two clips on top of each other. If you hover over your mouse over that, it says sequence, and that is a sequence.
For mine, it's just a bunch of pictures in here. How do you get into video format like that?
Oh, so if you're having the content looks different, what you need to do when you're importing is just choose the first image. Only the first image, and then go to options and make sure image sequence is turned on, and then click on import. And I'm going to right-click on my sequence in my project folder and then go to sequence settings and see what's going on. So a lot of this information is pointless to me. Square pixels is a good aspect ratio to work with. Right now, the default time base that's probably going to show up, or the default frames per second that's going to show up, is 29.97. Which is a sort of default frame rate for most of the video you see on the internet. Or in general, like broadcast television in general, unless it's like super HD, it's going to be 30 frames a second. Oh, let me turn on down the lights here. See that. Both are off. Both?
Both.
Okay, cool. Yeah, frame rate. So default, it's going to be 29.97. And like I said, when I went over the technical details for the midterm, I asked 24. Really, I just say that because it saves you a little bit of time in rendering. But if you're working in 24 frames a second in Blender, and you're seeing how the timing works, if you then bring it into a Premiere and leave it at 29 frames a second, it's going to be less time, the amount of frames you made, because it's eating up more frames a second to show that animation. So if you want to stay in 24 frames a second, you want to edit this and say 24 frames a second. Display format, 24 frames a second. And then hit OK. And if you want to work in 29, that's fine. And it doesn't really take that. Just make sure that when you're working in Blender, you're that setting for frames per second is also 29.97. So that visually, timing-wise and everything, and you know that you're filling the 30 seconds correctly. Anyway, so now we have our sequence here. Let's just watch it real quick.
I'm still downloading the audio and the frame file.
What's that?
I don't know why, but I'm still downloading the audio and the frame file.
The frame file should be a gigabyte, actually.
Really?
So
Okay.
that one might take some time. If the audio should be a pretty small file. Anyone else having trouble still downloading the frames? Some people got it. Anyways, if it's taking some time, just follow along here. And so playing this. Cool, excellent. If you're doing a lot of in-camera editing, so like if you're like doing a lot of camera switching, you probably have your timing right already for each of these sort of like edits, for these different changes. Like I feel pretty good about this. But if you wanted to sort of change the timing a little bit, pardon me, say like you're going here, like if I wanted, I'm like, oh, it hangs on that for too long. I want to maybe edit that sequence so it's a little bit shorter before the next camera takes. I could get my blade out. Where's my blade? Over here on the left. The shortcut for that is C. Find that point in time that I want to edit. And again, I'm just either left clicking and dragging the timeline marker here, or also using the left and right keys on my the arrow keys here on my keyboard to go forward and backwards in time. And then once the timeline markers in the spot I want to cut, I can just hover my blade tool over that and cut, move forward. And this is like a micromanaging kind of like detail, but just really just to practice that skill. And then after I make it edit there, I could select that empty space and hit delete to collapse that, or I could just simply move over, you know, my clip until it auto snaps. So, I don't know, sequence looks pretty good. You can edit this some. Again, because I'm encouraging, like I'm saying, you have to use 3 different cameras. Some of this editing is kind of already happening internally within Blender. But now let's maybe just move on to adding some sound effects. So I will, again, double click in what empty space exists in my project folder. Pardon me. Or I'm trying to remember where the actual, like, I don't know, you could right click and say import also. And instead of frames, I'm going to move to audio. And it looks like one of the files I grabbed was an FLAC, a FLAC file, and that's not supported. So I'm just going to import what is supported. Another thing I could do, I'm going to undo that. I could just choose the audio folder and then import. And when I do that, and it's saying it gave me an error message for the FLAC file. I now have a cool folder in my project folder or window that kind of helps organize things. And again, if you want to see thumbnail previews in your project window, there's a little icon down here to switch to icon view. If you just want to see a list, if you have more media you're working with and you don't have enough real estate on your screen, you can move to list. And that works too. I mean, that works for audio for sure. You can preview these clips by double clicking on them. So this right here is like the sound of a bowling ball hitting the ground and rolling. We have, what's this? Some dominoes falling. And then we have, what is this here? Oh, these are just some like sort of hammer hitting something metal sounds, which I guess was going to be the sound of like the hammer hitting the ball at the beginning. So we have these 3 audio files. And again, just a refresher where I got these. And there is a link now, come on, in our resources links on the main page to freesound.org. You have to log in. You have to create like an account with this site, but that is free. Just got to give them your email. And it is a really good resource. I've used it a lot professionally as an animator. When you're just looking for some Foley effects or some kind of sound, it's a huge database. It's a lot of people like sound geeks just out in the world with their like portable recorders, just like recording the sounds of the universe and publishing them. There's some music that is like royalty free. That's like okay, but I use it a lot for sound effects. And yeah, whatever you're making, search the name of the thing that you just made and see if anything shows up. Like what if we search UFO? We got like an old, like sort of classic UFO sound. All right, made with a saw. Anyways, we have some of these are probably pretty loud and crunchy. I'm gonna turn this down. Interesting. Sometimes I like to just hit play on all the sound effects on a page and see what happens. Anyways, that's freesound.org. So explore it. And that's where I got these files. So let's just start adding these to our scene. What was our first one? This is the bowling ball. And let's refresh what's going on. We have our smack, boom, and then a sort of crash sound. Oh, that's what I had. That's the file that didn't work, was the sound of like bowling balls getting hit. So maybe let's try this rolling sound towards the end, because we have like a situation where there's like sort of a hit and then like a rolling sound. So let's zoom in a little bit. So again, if you want to see with more clarity or zoom in terms of time in your sequence, at the bottom here, there's a scroll bar to move forward and backwards in time. But also, if you grab these handles on either side, you can zoom into time to see with more clarity, a more micro version of time. Let's see where this makes contact here. Right here. And let's move our sound clip a little bit closer. Let's zoom in a little bit. And another thing that's nice to do when you're working with audio files is, which you don't generally do when you're working with video clips, to like sort of zoom in and make them look vertically bigger, because like, how does that really help me seeing this purple bar bigger? But if you do that with audio, you can see with more clarity the waveform that's being displayed. Does anybody understand how a waveform works? A waveform is like what we're looking at right here. It is the visual representation of a digital audio file. It is like, in basic terms, what we're looking at is the amplitude or the volume of our audio file currently. So we can see that it starts quiet, and then there's a peak in volume, which is probably when there's that contact sound in the audio, which then tapers off to this sort of like equal tone rolling. So we want that peak sound to be timed with contact, the domino, and this ball. So I'm going to move my timeline marker over a little bit and scoot over my audio so it snaps to that timeline marker. And that works pretty good. Another thing we could do here, so we could, if we can't really hear this very well, we could adjust the gain on this. Let me see if we do this. Where do we find that? So in the effect controls, where you might adjust opacity, like if I click on a video clip and I go to my effect controls tab, the top left, we have options for motion to change the position of that video clip in our canvas. We have options for rotating that. We also have opacity to sort of change the clearness or the transparency of our video clip. If we click on an audio clip, we have different options. We have volume, and we have sort of like channel volume and channel level, sort of like left and right stereo effects. I'm not really going to mess with that, but I am going to mess with level. And just like anything else really in not After Effects, Premiere, we can add a keyframe to our audio if we want. So if I'm just going to crank this a little bit, sorry to the people close to the speakers. So if I feel like this first hit is actually loud enough, and that is at the level I need for it to be heard. And if I make it go any louder, that's going to clip. And again, when I hit play and I'm listening to this, there is a visual representation of how loud that sound is to the right, and our meter to the right. And when I hit play, we see that hit sound got to just under 0. And this is a meter that reads decibels, so it's just under 0 decibel. Essentially, using this meter, you don't want anything to go above. If anything goes above 0, that means it's going to be clipping, which essentially means you're overwhelming this sort of audio channel, and it's going to get crunchy. It's going to get really distorted, and it's not going to sound good to anyone that's listening to it, especially on headphones. And so you want to generally have things just under 0, kind of in this sweet spot that's sort of like orange right here. And of course, you don't want to have, unless you're creating content that is existing in a void of space, you don't want to have 0 volume. In general, you like to have, if you have audio, you want to hear it, is all I'm trying to say. So maybe one thing I could do is I could add a keyframe here. So I could go after that peak sound occurs, I could turn on a keyframe for level, and then I can move forward and just turn it up a little bit. We'll turn it up to like this. And then I can adjust that later down here visually on top of that clip. And then we can exaggerate this some to actually hear what's going on. So that made it, you can see visually we went from down to, let's see, around 30. If we cranked it up here, we brought that sort of ambient rolling sound up to 18. So it's more present in our mix. Another thing that we could do is so we have this nice rolling sound, but this sound ends abruptly before our like that whole action is done. And you don't want this sound that you are associating with this like sort of rolling action to stop mid-action. So what are some strategies we could employ here to have the same audio exist? You could stretch it out. So one thing you could do is you could adjust the time of this audio clip so it exists to the end of this clip here. And to do that, I could right-click on it and then choose Speed Duration. Now, the current clip time is about 4 seconds. Let's see how much time we need to add to this. So the end of this video clip where the ball is actually touching something and rolling, it's around 14 seconds, 17 frames. And again, we're working with 24 frames a second, so that's nearly 15 seconds. You see, when we look at our timeline counter, we have hours, minutes, seconds, and then next to that is frames, which is sort of like the amount of frames clicking through before we get a second. And that resets or adds a new second every 24 frames because we're working on 24 frames a second. So we're at about 14 seconds, 17 frames, and our clip now ends at 13 seconds. So we could just add, say, 2 seconds or 1.5 seconds to this. So right click, speed duration, and we could go to duration here and just say, we'll just make it even 6 seconds. Another thing we can do, if we wanted to, we could reverse the sound. I don't want to do that. We could also click maintain audio pitch. Maybe we wouldn't have known it or noticed it as much because we're not extending or sort of stretching out this clip as much. But if you stretch out a clip, what's going to happen to sort of the tone or the quality of it? What's that? You're going to lose quality. Also, that clip is going to like sound lower in pitch. It's going to be like, you know, like when you slow things down, it gets that sort of slow motion sound. That's because it's like, that's just how it works. I can't tell you, you know, like physically why that works, but that's what happens when you slow down. You're slowing down a clip, so it's going to sound slower and it's going to lose its pitch. It's going to go down in pitch. So we want to so you can turn this on to maintain the audio pitch. So Premiere does its best to sort of like calculate that on the fly and sort of compensate for that. So if you hit OK, we now have a longer clip, and let's see how it sounds. Perfect. And it looks like we got like actually a boom. Did we clip at the beginning? We do clip. You see that red mark right here? That means that first, and maybe that was because of the effect we just applied, we now are clipping. So maybe this first keyframe I have right here might go -0 until, yeah, it's no longer clipping. It's always good to not have clipping sounds. So, what else do we have here? Maybe I won't worry about the crash. Let's just do one other audio clip. Let's see what we have here. Okay, let's use the domino. So where's our domino effect? Looks like it starts right about here. And we're going to grab this and drop it in. And again, let's hit play and see what's going on. Much shorter. So again, we could extend this. Another thing we could do is we could get like really sort of like fine-tuned. If we like the quality and speed of that, but that it sounds like the sound of that that domino ripple effect is quicker than what's happening visually on screen. So we wouldn't want to keep this speed anyway. So let's see here. We're looking at essentially double the time. So I'm going to right-click on this, speed duration. We'll say 200. No, 50%. So 50% speed means half speed, so that means double the time. Maintain audio pitch. Let's see how that sounds. Dude, that actually lined up pretty good. And you might actually find the same thing happening with you. Simply because, like, I feel that I call it the Pink Floyd effect, where it's just like people naturally, when they hear audio, especially music, and have visual content, even if it's not linked intentionally, your brain will sort of create meaning with those things. in small ways even with this. Your brain wants to sort of make sense out of these two things that are happening at the same time. Anyway, so we got our domino effect. That's good. And maybe, let's see what else we got. We had one other hit. Let's use this. This is the sound. And again, you are working with layers here with audio, just like you're working with them in video. So if you have layers on top of each other, they're both going to play at the same time. And it looks like also I'm going to mute this layer I just added. So I'm going to click M here to mute that track. And I'm going to play this domino effect again and look at my volume meter. It stays within, it doesn't clip, but it is kind of loud. It is like up to that point. And so I'm going to just adjust that a little bit. I'm going to go to Effect Controls. I'm not going to add a keyframe. I'm just going to say something like -2. And it automatically added a keyframe. So whatever. One keyframe is fine. -2. Better. So I'm going to unmute this track. I just brought in a series of hits that I'm going to use for that hammer. I'll choose the first one. I'm going to zoom in. So I'm listening to this. I hear that hammer hit, but also visually, because I can see the waveform of this, I can just visually isolate that action. And I can go to, right here is where the sound starts. So I'm going to just clip right before that. I'm going to get my blade tool. Shortcut is C. Click there. I'm going to hit V to get my selection tool. Select the audio in front of that. Hit delete to delete that. And then I'll move just past the end of that sound and give it a little bit of a handle, a little extra space, because why not? And then I'm going to cut that and then delete the rest. And then let's see here. Let's move our timeline marker to where that first connection happens. And also another thing I might want to do, this setup here at the very beginning, it shows that ball sort of like floating a little bit in space and then resting. I'm going to cut that out. I think I'm actually just going to have from here. Looks better. And then I could select everything and move everything forward if I wanted to. So let's find that moment where it gets hit right there. And then let's sync up our audio clip to that. And we don't have the bowling ball crash. For demo purposes, I feel like this works. All right, I'm going to save my project. One thing that I like to do, and I think it's just a good practice, is to give your video a second of just black titles or emptiness or anything else you could have it fade from another color to on either end of your work, so that once the work is done, it fades to black or it cuts to black, and then there's an understanding that the content is done, and then the video ends. Simply because it gives like an introduction and like ending, your intro and ending of your animation, some breathing room. So when you're watching this in class, when the animation is done, it's just not like, and then it just stops and you see like the replay icon over your work. You need to be able to see the ending, and then maybe it fades to black or cuts to black, and then you have your titles, and then it's like, okay, the animation is done now. Now we can end it. You know, give it some like what you might call an interesting handles at either end. I don't know if they actually. I think it's a good look, so I'm going to do that for mine. Just a second at the beginning, And at the second, I could have like maybe an introduction title or not, or I could fade if I wanted to. Let's see, how could I do that? If I wanted to fade, I could go to Effects here, Video Transitions, Dissolve. Let's just try Cross Dissolve. And if I want to make that shorter, I can see that effect on my clip, and I can click and drag that to adjust the timing. And then maybe I'll just have a dip to white at the end. Oh no, that looks bad. We'll just have it end there and then give it an extra second. And so when you are exporting videos, when you're about to like render out your now video, your MP4 from your rendered images, if I were to just go, I'd of course save my project, and then I'd go File, Export, Media. If I were to do this straight out of the bat like this, the final frame would be the last frame of animation or of video content. We have the sort of intro fade in, but we don't have that sort of like handle at the end, that sort of like breath at the end. To do that, you need to, because when you default export, it just looks for the last piece of media in your sequence and renders up to that point. So if I had like a sort of loose stray clip here, like if I had like a loose clip, if I was like organizing my workflow and there was like a loose clip over here, it would render all the way out to here. So in order to have more control over this, I'm going to tell Premiere when to stop and start rendering. So what I can do here is I'll find the point at which I want it to stop rendering, the end of my video clip, get my timeline marker there, and then go to Sequence. Where is it? Markers. I go to Markers, Mark Out. And by default, it just assumes the very beginning of your animation is where it will start, but you could move your marker to the beginning and go to Markers, Mark In. And now, in my sequence, I have these markers that showed up. And I can now adjust these at any point, and whatever's contained within these markers will be rendered. Or I can tell Premiere to do that once I go to export. So I'm going to go to File, Export, Media. What format should I be using? Anybody remember what's good for YouTube or Vimeo? MP4. Bingo. What would I choose on this list to create an MP4? Because nothing in this list says MP4. I don't know if anybody can actually see this. But does anybody remember? Bingo, H.264. H.264 is essentially MP4. In your mind, if you see H.264, it means MP4. And so if I choose H.264, we can see our output name is now 001.mp4. The match source, the preset here is a high bit rate, which is good. You can choose other presets for this format. There are like Vimeo 1080p HD, YouTube 1080p HD. Let's try YouTube 1080p, which is what we're working in. And so we have our output name. I'm going to click there. I'm going to change it because I'm not going to call my midterm 0001. I'm going to call it midterm. And maybe add my name to it or something. I'm going to save it in my midterm folder. And let's check our settings. We can see here to the left, we have a source and output tab. So we can see, we can scrub through our timeline and look at our animation, how we saw it in our timeline and how it's going to be output. I like to just double check the output. If you have like a weird setting, say like if when we had QuickTime or when we had QuickTime to default set, and we look at our output tab, what's going on? We have these black bars on the top and bottom of our video. We do not want this. Why do you think this is happening?
Aspect ratio.
Aspect ratio could be off. The sort of formatting, the ratio of the format for output is off. We can double check. If we look in the summary options here, we can see our output and our source. Our source is at 1080 by or 1920 by 1080, which is good, but the output by default is at 720 by 480. So that's a different ratio and a much smaller size. So it's a ratio that is less wide than it is tall. So our video isn't fully filling the frame, and so we know something's wrong. So good to double check. If you see those black bars on top and bottom, something's going wrong. You need to check your settings. I'm going to choose H.264, which is good. Maybe I'll choose this YouTube 1080p HD preset. I named it. I double checked it. Output looks good. Our frames look good. Frames per second look good. And our estimated file size is only 33, which is awesome. So at this point, I could just click export. I could also click Q. If I click Q, what it does is it takes this and it outputs it to a different Adobe program called Media Encoder, which sometimes has better options for encoding media than just straight out of Premiere. I don't know why. Sometimes maybe it goes a little bit faster, but for what we're doing, I mean, that just outputted it like what? Like it's already done. So export, and now we have our midterm. We can watch it on our computer. And you see how much nicer it is to have those sort of like handles, that sort of like introduction void at the beginning. Otherwise, like it's just you see the first frame, and when you hit play, you're already like out of the gate. You don't have time for your eyes to be like, okay, I'm watching an animation. Oh, here it is. You know, it's just like poof, we're going. You know, and then like it's going, and then it just stops. You know, anything you see, any media you see, especially film or animations, they have some sort of way to end it. There's a fade to black, or there's some kind of strategy. You as the director get to choose this, but something to end your work. Oh, it's a way to sort of gracefully put it into it and then like lower the levels, and it's like, all right, it's done. You know, roll credits. So let's just watch it. Need sound effects. Voila. Magnificent. All right. So that is it for this demo. Well, I'm just going to stop the video, and then I can answer any questions.